Good Sunday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading. Today is March the 19th, and today we're reading in Exodus chapter 5 and Exodus chapter 6. We're looking at some more details concerning a number of offerings that we've already looked a little bit at: sin offerings and guilt offerings, burnt offerings, grain offerings. You can talk a little bit about a sin offering here, or some more about the sin offering at the end. So we're going to start with some sin offerings, conclude with some sin offerings, and have some various offerings in between. A lot of this is going to be procedural. There we go. Procedural, which is telling them exactly how it's supposed to be done. And then at the end, once we get to chapter 6, beginning verse number 8, we're really going to focus in on the priest and their role that they have to play in all of this. And I think certainly this is looking forward to Christ and understanding his mediation intercession for us today. Let's begin reading here before I have to keep saying some words I don't know how to pronounce, apparently. Let's see here. We are reading in Exodus chapter 6 and verse number 1. Exodus 6, verse number 1. Or excuse me, Exodus 5. Let me back up a bit. Exodus 5 and verse number 1 is where we're starting today. Leviticus, man, we're going to get it eventually. Leviticus chapter 5 and verse number 1. Final say, that's my final offer. Leviticus chapter 5 and verse number 1. When someone sins in any of these ways, if he has seen, heard, or known about something he has witnessed and did not respond to a public call to testify, he will bear his iniquity. Or if someone touches anything unclean, a carcass or an unclean wild animal, or unclean livestock, or an unclean swarming creature without being aware of it, he is unclean and incurs guilt. Or if he touches human uncleanness, any uncleanness by which one can become defiled without being aware of it, but later recognizes it, he incurs guilt. Or if someone swears rashly to do what is good or evil concerning anything, a person may speak rashly in an oath without being aware of it, but later recognizes it, he incurs guilt in such an instance. If someone incurs guilt in one of these cases, he is to confess he has committed that sin. He must bring his penalty for guilt for the sin he has committed to Yahweh, a female lamb or goats from the flock as a sin offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement on his behalf for his sin. If he cannot afford an animal from the flock, then he may bring to Yahweh 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons as penalty for guilt for his sin, one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. He is to bring them to the priest, who will first present the one for the sin offering. He is to twist its head at the back of the neck without severing it. Then he will sprinkle some of the blood of the sin offering on the side of the altar, while the rest of the blood is to be drained out at the base of the altar. It is a sin offering. He will prepare the second bird as a burnt offering according to the regulation. In this way, the priest will make atonement on his behalf for the sin he has committed, and he will be forgiven. But if he cannot afford 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, he may bring 2 quarts of fine flour as an offering for his sin. He must not put olive oil or frankincense on it, for it is a sin offering. He is to bring it to the priest, who will take a handful of it as its memorial portion and burn it on the altar along with the food offerings to Yahweh. It is a sin offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement on his behalf concerning the sin he has committed in any of these cases, and he will be forgiven. The rest will belong to the priest, like the grain offering. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, if someone offends by sinning unintentionally in regard to any of Yahweh's holy things, he must bring his penalty for guilt to Yahweh, an unblemished ram from the flock, based on your assessment of its value in silver shekels, according to the sanctuary shekel, as a guilt offering. He is to make restitution for his sin regarding any holy thing, adding 1/5 of its value to it, and give it to the priest. Then the priest will make atonement on his behalf with the ram of the guilt offering, and he will be forgiven. If someone sins and without knowing it violates any of Yahweh's commands concerning anything prohibited, he is guilty, and he will bear his iniquity. He must bring an unblemished ram from the flock according to your assessment of its value as a guilt offering to the priest. Then the priest will make atonement on his behalf for the error he has committed unintentionally, and he will be forgiven. It is a guilt offering. He is indeed guilty before Yahweh. Leviticus chapter 6, Yahweh spoke to Moses when someone sins and offends Yahweh by deceiving his neighbor in regard to a deposit, a security, or a robbery, or defrauds his neighbor, or finds something lost and lies about it, or swears falsely about any of the sinful things a person may do. Once he has sinned and acknowledged his guilt, he must return what he stole or defrauded, or the deposit entrusted to him, or the lost item he found, or anything else about which he swore falsely. He will make a full restitution for it and add a fifth of its value to it. He is to pay it to its owner on the day he acknowledges his guilt. Then he is to bring his guilt offering to Yahweh, an unblemished ram from the flock according to your assessment of its value, as a guilt offering to the priest. In this way, the priest will make atonement on his behalf before Yahweh, and he will be forgiven for anything he has done to incur guilt. Yahweh spoke to Moses, command Aaron and his sons. This is the law of the burnt offering. The burnt offering itself must remain on the altar's hearth all night until morning, while the fire of the while the fire of the altar is kept burning on it. The priest is to put on his linen robe and linen undergarments. He is to remove the ashes of the burnt offering from the fire. He is to remove the ashes of the burnt offering the fire has consumed on the altar and place them beside the altar. Then he will take off his garments, put on other clothes, and bring the ashes outside the camp to a ceremonially clean place. The fire on the altar is to be kept burning. It must not go out. Every morning the priest will burn wood on the fire. He is to arrange the wood, or he is to arrange the burnt offering on the fire and burn the fat portions from the fellowship offerings on it. Fire must be kept burning on the altar continually. It must not go out. Now, this is the law of the grain offering. Aaron's sons will present it before Yahweh in front of the altar. The priest is to remove a handful of fine flour and olive oil from the grain offering with all the frankincense that is on the offering, and burn its memorial portion on the altar as a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. Aaron and his sons may eat the rest of it. It is to be eaten in the form of unleavened bread in a holy place. They are to eat it in the courtyard of the tent of meeting. It must not be baked with yeast. Excuse me. I have assigned it as their portion from my food offerings. It is especially holy, like the sin offering and the guilt offering. Any male among Aaron's descendants may eat it. It is a permanent portion throughout your generations from the food offerings to Yahweh. Anything that touches the offerings will become holy. Yahweh spoke to Moses. This is the offering that Aaron and his sons are to present to Yahweh on the day that he is anointed: 2 quarts of fine flour as a regular grain offering, half of it in the middle and half of it in the evening. It is to be prepared with oil on a griddle. You are to bring it well kneaded. You are to present it as a grain offering of baked pieces, a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. The priest, who is one of Aaron's sons, will be anointed to take his place. Who will be anointed to take his place is to prepare it. It must be completely burned as a permanent portion for Yahweh. Every grain offering for a priest will be a whole burnt offering. It is not to be eaten. Yahweh spoke to Moses, tell Aaron and his sons, this is the law of the sin offering. The sin offering is most holy and must be slaughtered before Yahweh at the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered. The priest who offers it as a sin offering will eat it. It is to be eaten in a holy place in the courtyard of the tent of meeting. Anything that touches its flesh will become holy, and if any of its blood splatters on a garment, you must wash the garment in a holy place. A clay pot in which the sin offering is boiled is to be broken. If it is boiled in a bronze vessel, it is to be scoured and rinsed with water. Any male among the priests may eat it. It is especially holy, but no sin offering may be eaten if its blood has been brought into the tent of meeting to make atonement in the holy place. It must be burned. And that is Leviticus chapter 5 and Leviticus chapter 6. All right, thinking about this text today, just a few observations here. In chapter 5, these sins that we are talking about are sins of omission, it seems, things that they failed to do. Number one, failed to give a testimony, basically withholding evidence. You have evidence about this particular case and you fail to give that. That is withholding this information. Whenever it comes to touching something that is unclean, or coming across something of a human nature that is unclean. There's also here concerning rash swearing and vows. All of these things would be atoned for through, number one, confession. And once this confession is made, then there needs to be let's see, reparations, I believe, that need to be done. Let me double check here. Yes. Well, no, actually, sorry. The reparations for the next one never comes to defrauding. In this case, it begins with a confession, and then it can be alleviated. The issue can be resolved through what God allows to be this provision, which is the provision of sacrifice. So that's the first 13 verses just talk about if they're aware of any obligations that have been left undone, or if there's been contact with any sort of impurities. Number one, you confess it. And then number two, you make the appropriate sacrifice to atone for that. And one of the other things that's very interesting about this text is it shows that God desires for anyone to be able to have access to him and to have access to these provisions. You know, if you don't have enough for an animal to be sacrificed, a non-flying animal, then you can do the 2 turtle doves or a young pigeon. If you don't have that, for the poorest of people, you can give fine flour as your sacrifice. So again, God here is just showing that he wants to be accessible to people of all socioeconomic levels. It's not just for the rich. God is not just a God of the rich. He's especially a God of the poor here in this case. Secondly, whenever we talk about the guilt offering here, this is those people who are that there's been some sort of defrauding on their part, whether they defraud God of something belonging to him, or whether they defraud something concerning their neighbor. Normally, in this case, this would be things that only they would know about. Well, once they become guilty of these things, once they feel conviction concerning what they have done, once there is a guilt within them that has been incurred, then they have the opportunity to number one, again, confess that confession is something that shows up a couple times here in chapter 5, something that we haven't seen that much of before, but confession is to be made. And then secondly, now there's to be restitution that is made. We see the restitution is made in verse number 5, where you also add on a little bit of value. The same thing is true once you get into the first part of chapter 6. Again, restitution is made, add a fifth of its value to it once you make that restitution. And then if you do that, if you confess, if you make restitution, then you can find forgiveness and restoration. Verse number 7 is very similar. Verse number 7 of chapter 6 is very similar to verse number 18 of chapter 5, and also verse 16 of chapter 5. Again, both of these show that once these things are done, once there's confession and restitution and sacrifice, well, then you can have atonement, which leads to forgiveness. Beginning in chapter 6 and verse number 8, here, Leviticus chapter 6, verse number 8, the focus again is on the priest's role in what they are doing here within this particular text. Whenever it comes to the burnt offering, this offering is made to allow the priest to mediate for the people. They should be able to ensure those who are coming to them that there will be personal, that there will be, this sacrifice will be acceptable to God on their behalf, that they are playing a mediating role between the people and their God. So these people, then these ministers, these priests, must make sure that they have personal sanctification and that they are performing the appropriate spiritual service that God would have them to do. So we see that in verses 8 through 13. And then in verse 14 on, again, these priests are representing the worshiper. We're representing the loyal devotion that the worshiper would have to God. So they make sure that they receive these things. Part of them eating portions of these sacrifices is a representation to the offerer that God is accepting them. We've seen this a number of times in chapter 2 and verse 3, here in chapter 6 and verse 17, and again in chapter 6 and verse 29, that whenever the priests eat these sacrifices, they are especially holy to the Lord. Why? Well, because they are the personal representatives of God to the people. So as they then eat this meal, as they eat this sacrifice, that is to give assurance to the people that God is accepting of that sacrifice as well. So we see that here within the text. And then whenever they offer a particular sacrifice, not whenever a worshiper uses them to offer a sacrifice, but whenever the priests themselves offer a sacrifice, there's no portion for them, and that is be a whole burnt offering. So there's a differentiation between the offering of a priest himself and then the offering of a common person through the priest. So all this, just getting back to, again, for me, whenever I'm thinking about this, just the important role of the priest, again, being that mediating factor between God and the people. And we're so thankful, of course, to have a great high priest in Jesus who is able to do such for us today. But then we should also recognize our need to be mediators between God and people of this world. If they do not know God, we can be the best conduit for them to come to know God, to lead them to know about the Lord and to have a relationship with him and to dedicate themselves to him as well. So continue to think about that as we're going through this text. Think about the role of the high priest, think about the role of the priest. And of course, this is all building towards our next study, the first Sunday in April, as we're going to talk about Christians as being the priesthood of God today. If you have any questions or comments about this text here in Leviticus chapter 5 or Leviticus chapter 6, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below, or a question in the comment section below. I'd love to discuss with you, and any further details that you'd like to think about. I appreciate the questions that I do get. Sometimes I think I might know the answer immediately. Sometimes I need to go back and do some digging. So I got to do one for Jackie, talking about the role that women might have in doing this. If they were able to offer sacrifices or their husbands had to come do that for them, I'll have to do some reading to see if I can figure out to give a good answer to that. But I do appreciate the questions, and I hope that they lead you to an even greater understanding of the text. I'm really excited about being with everyone here in a little bit for our Bible studies at 10 o'clock, and then for our worship assembly at 11. Looking forward to continuing our study through the Gospel of Mark as we look at Jesus, continuing to interact with those who might oppose him, who might chastise him or his disciples for this or that. And the main point we're going to look at today is that the Messiah, Jesus, he is the Lord of the Sabbath. And there's some really strong ramifications for that reality. We're going to talk about that today as we study together in the worship hour. Again, looking forward to seeing everybody then. Have a great rest of your Lord's Day. Take care. We'll be back at it again tomorrow as we read together through, let me double check, Leviticus chapter 7. We'll see you then. Take care, and God bless.